Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 46, a song of confidence. We begin with the superscription for the choir director, a psalm of the sons of Korah. That's quite familiar. But notice here, this is set to Alamot. And that term Alamot, actually set to Alamoth is Al Alamot. Uh, Set to or upon the Alamoth, whatever Alamoth is. And that term Alamoth is the feminine plural of the Hebrew word Alma. And if you're familiar with Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, you know, that passage that in most of our Bibles is translated, a virgin will conceive. That term virgin is Alma. Now, literally it doesn't quite mean virgin. It actually means a young maiden, young girl. Of course, a gentleman assumes that a young girl is a virgin, and so that works for a translation. But in this case, set to Alamot probably means that maybe this is a soprano piece. You're going to hear the voices of the young girls, the voices of the maidens, and that's the timbre of the song. And notice that it's called a song. That's why we've titled it as such. Now we begin. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So notice he's both refuge, he is strength. Very, just describing a place of safety, a place of not safety if you're against him. The strength can work for you if you're on his side. It can work against you if you're not on his side. But here, this is speaking to those who are loyal to the Lord, a very present help in trouble. Notice the present idea of that help, and this is the term nimtza, and that which is found, literally. Um, and that works nicely. This is the nifal of metzah. Nifal means that it's the passive. So he is passively doing that. He is passive. He shows up. He's made to show up. Can I say it that way? Although nobody makes God do anything. But the fact that he shows up, the fact that it's found, perhaps hints that yes, he is present, but he's not. He doesn't always appear to be present until you need him. So um, there are times where it looks like what's going to happen, and yet he shows up. He's found to be there. Sometimes it seems like at the last minute in time of trouble where he is there. Psalm 37, verse 36 has this exact same term, still in the nifal, still in the passive. I sought for him, but he could not be found. And so, that which is found, that which is present, and notice it has that term moth, very present. Meoth is the very that's connected to that. So same word is going to be used. We already saw it back in Psalm chapter 37. Let's go now to verse 2. Therefore, we will not fear because we have this very present help. Therefore, we will not fear though the earth should change. Now, we're talking about some things that don't normally change. Normally the earth is, it sort of can be the earth can be depended upon to be there. Yeah, I don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh my goodness, is the earth going to be there?" And remember, when they said the earth back in the scriptures, they're not thinking in terms of a globe. They'd never seen that. They're just thinking of the thing that I'm standing on, and that doesn't really change. Though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, and again, mountains aren't something that usually go away. If there's a mountain there yesterday, likelihood it's going to be there today as well. Uh, but even though the mountains should slip into the heart of the sea, those are two things that are very sturdy and you can depend on them to be there. But then, verse 3, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. And when you talk about the waters, and even when you talked about the sea, those are places to the Jewish mind that were dangerous. The Jewish people, by and large, they were a group of landlubbers. Think about this in the Old Testament, New Testament too. Anytime you see a Jewish person getting into a boat, they're asking for trouble. They even referred to the Sea of Galilee as a sea instead of a big lake. They were more acquainted with the desert and the land and the earth and the mountains than they were with the ocean. And so, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride, and the idea here is when the unchangeable changes, we can still trust in the Lord. We can still have confidence in Him. We will not fear, though the unchangeable changes. So verses 2 and 3 describe the waters of the sea where they're chaotic, they're dangerous in the midst of those sorts of changes. But now we see a different sort of water. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. So now we have streams of life-giving water, that is a life-giving river, in contrast to the chaotic sea, um, and it makes glad the city of God. Now, when we hear the city of God, two ideas can come to mind. One, of course, if you're in the Old Testament, and especially if you're in the Psalms, you talk about the city of God, you think obviously of Jerusalem, a city that had started its life as a Canaanite city, but then it had been captured by King David, and he had made it the capital city, his capital. Of all of Israel, and of course Israel had eventually split into north and south, but it continued to be the place where the temple was, and that's going to be referenced in a moment. So it's the city of God in the sense that it's the city where God's presence was manifested. But from a New Testament point of view, we also have a reference in Hebrews chapter 12 about how there is the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, where there are angels and the general assembly and the church of the firstborn. And Hebrews chapter 12, we're not going to go there, but verses 21 through 24 sort of develop that. And so as we hear these words, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, we have two ideas before us. You say, which one is correct? And the answer is yes. It's both ideas. Where the earthly Jerusalem was meant to be a picture of the better Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of heaven itself. And so notice in this case, the holy dwelling place is plural, of the Most High. Now that term dwelling places, mishkaneh, and the Mishkan, this is just the plural. The Mishkaneh is plural of Mishkan. Mishkan is the term that's usually translated in the Old Testament tabernacle, but it doesn't have to be the tabernacle. In this case, the tabernacle was never in Jerusalem. Instead, the temple replaced the tabernacle. And so the temple was there, but it was still a holy place. And then verse 5, God is in the midst of her. Now, the her refers back to the city. Everything in Hebrew is either masculine or plural. There is no neuter in Hebrew. So city is feminine, and God is in the midst of her. That is the city. She will not be moved. So even though the mountains crumble and the earth be moved, and yet God's city, not necessarily talking about the city of Jerusalem on earth, because frankly that was moved. In fact, that saw a number of destructions. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. It was destroyed again by the Romans in 70 AD. And it's there today, and it's okay to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I think we can pray for peace, but to say she will not be moved, I think that's really the heavenly city that will not be moved. In fact, the term "moved" there, you notice God will help her when morning dawns. We're going to see that term repeated in a second. The nations made an uproar. The kingdoms tottered, and there is that same term that earlier was translated "moved" in verse 5. Of course, if something totters, it just moved, and I suppose if it moved, it might have been tottering, and that might have been the sort of move. I wish they'd pick one. And sure enough, when the Legacy Standard Version, that's an update of the New American Standard that we're using here, and that came out just a couple of years ago, and they render them both these terms as shaken, which I like that. If something's shaken, it totters and it moves. And that reminds me of how the New Testament describes how we will receive a kingdom and an inheritance that is not shaken. That theme is going to be developed both later on in the Old Testament and again in the New Testament. But the nations made an uproar. The kingdoms, I like that. were shaken, he raised his voice. And so notice you have the nations, the kingdom, and then he raised his voice, the earth melted. So all of these things down here are moved. They melt, they totter, they are shaken. And verse 7 now is the refrain. And the reason I call this the refrain, the Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our stronghold, and then we have that little term Selah, which seems to indicate a pause, maybe a musical notation. And in this case, I think it is letting us know that this is the refrain. When you sing a song and you come to you sing a portion of it, and that portion is later on repeated in the song, that's what we call a refrain. And so this verse 7 is going to be repeated again before we're finished with the psalm, which makes it the refrain, the repeated part. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Continue into verse 8. Come, behold the works of the Lord. And so here we have a command. Now, the works of the Lord, if you just heard that term works of the Lord, you might think creation and trees and rivers and life. But notice who has wrought part of the works of the Lord are desolations in the earth. Some of that shakenness that took place, some of that movement that was bad movement, God brought He brought those about. Who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease. Sometimes he does that by bringing peace. Sometimes he does that by having victory. The wars stop because he's won them. And it can happen either way. Ultimately, let me just say, my view of eschatology is at the end, Jesus is going to win, and the Lord wins. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. Now, how he does that, well, we'll see. But here we have the Lord being presented as a military conqueror, where he breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. And so in this case, he's making wars to cease by winning those wars. Now, that term chariots, the Hebrew galut, when you have that oath ending, that's feminine plural. And so usually that term is used. In fact, I think almost every other time it's used in the Old Testament, it describes either wagons or carts. I think of Genesis 45:19, where the sons of Jacob have been invited by Joseph to go down and resettle in Egypt, and they pack up all their belongings, not on chariots. They didn't have chariots. They had wagons and or carts, and they moved them down later on. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verses 7 and 8, where the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant, and it was doing bad things there in the cities of Philistia. So they decide to send it back. They don't put it in a chariot; they put it in a cart. And they shoo it along, and it returns to the Israelites. But our translators here rendered it chariots. Now, it's interesting, when we look at the Septuagint, that LXX is shorthand for the Septuagint. That is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. It renders it with the Greek term thurios. And that's actually the word for shields. You say, well, what's that about? I'm not sure, because if there's a homonym where there's a term that either looks like or even close to the term chariots or wagons with the term shield, I don't know of it. And I looked. So perhaps, and this is sort of out there, but perhaps there was a text somewhere, a Hebrew text, that had, instead of the word wagon or cart or chariot, perhaps they were taking that from a Hebrew text that had shields. That's the only way I can imagine that the Septuagint would bring that up, or maybe it was just a bad translation. I don't know which it was. But it renders it shields, which would fit if we look at the parallelism. So he breaks notice the bow and the spear, those are weapons, and then a shield would also be a weapon, defensive, but still a weapon. I guess a chariot would be too. I think that's probably why our translators from both the King James and the New American Standard rendered it chariots. They were trying to see the parallelism with the previous line. The NIV, the New English Translation, the New Revised Standard Version all follow the Septuagint in rendering it shields. The JPS, that's the Jewish Tanakh version, and it renders it wagons, which actually that's what I would have done. That's literal, and maybe that's the way they should have gone. I'm not sure. I'm not trying to pass judgment. Just reporting on that. Well, verse 8 gave that command, "Come, behold the works of the Lord." Now we come to verse 10, and God speaks. The psalmist has been speaking up to this point, but now God speaks, and he says, "Cease striving and know that I am God." And so notice the commands, in verse 8, it was come and behold. Now God speaks and he says, cease, or I like be still. I think one of the translations rendered it, be still and know that I am God. And that works as well. Notice the translators put that term striving in italics. They added that. Um, be still works, and the striving part, I think, comes from the context. So I think that's there. But stop and know that I am God. And then he gives two, notice, I will be exalted among the nations. And he says that once, and then he says it again, I will be exalted in the earth. So two exaltations as God speaks. And then we come to verse 11, and again we have the refrain. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our stronghold. But before we leave, and of course, we end and then with Selah. Again, there's that rest, that pause, and it's a permanent pause because the psalm is now over. But I want to look at that phrase, "The Lord of hosts is with us." Now, that's not an unusual term, and it's not an unusual either English or Hebrew, but I still want to mention it because this is the Hebrew Imanu. He is with us. And remember how we started off by noting something in the superscription that we had seen back in Isaiah 7:14, where the Lord says, "I'm going to give you a sign: the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel." And it's that same Emmanuel that we see here. He is with us. And of course, Emmanuel is speaking of God with us, and it's reminding us that a young girl, a maiden, a virgin, did conceive and bear a son. And God came near, and he is still with us in the person of Jesus, who came to be with us, who came to die in our place so that we can trust in him and have eternal life. And he says, think about this at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. He says, "And lo, I am with you always."